Alors, bonjour, bienvenue.
Good morning, and I welcome you to the IDRC, dear friends and colleagues and invited guests and members of the diplomatic organization and from the academic world and from the corporate. My name is Jean Lobel. I'm VP of the program and the partnerships at IDRC, and I'm also the interim president, and I am honored to welcome this morning an extraordinary person.
To welcome this morning extraordinary figure of the last century and of this century is Dr. Daniel Hillel, the World Food Prize 2012. Welcome, Dr. Hillel. For those not familiar with the World Food Prize, it's the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in agriculture. It was created by the late Norman Borlaug, often called the father of the Green Revolution, with his work on dwarf wheat. And part of his Nobel Prize served, I believe, as an endowment to create the World Food Prize that is still chaired today by M.S. Swaminathan, who is in India a figure and in the world of savvy when it comes to agricultural development, and was a very close colleague of Dr. Borlaug. And as Dr. Borlaug said to me one day, and said in many instances, he would never have gotten the Nobel Peace Prize in the 70s if it was not for the work that he did with Swaminathan. Dr. Hillel was named the 2012 laureate for his pioneering contribution to technique that is called drip irrigation, and I'm sure he will explain to you what is drip irrigation. But in short, rather than bringing a ton of water at one point in time to crops, you bring drops of water over a long-term period to crops. And this technique has revolutionized agriculture in many places. The work began in Israel in his youth, spread throughout the Middle East, and this innovative water management concept was taken and grabbed in many other countries, in fact, over 30 countries, and I think that's fairly conservative, and over 6 million hectares worldwide. What I learned in the last 48 hours with Daniela is incredible, because the relationship with the center is a long-lasting one. Le Dr. Hillel...
Dr. Hillel met our first president, David Hopper, in the early 70s when he was organizing a visit of President Hopper at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and that organization was created by Dr. Hillel.
Dr. Hopper invited Dr. Hillel over here, and as a result of the visit, he received a fellowship from IDRC. I have a picture of him at that time, young, ongoing, and, you know, he's still young and ongoing, so that's wonderful. And this relationship has lasted since then, but it's the first time since 72 or 73, we're not sure, that he's coming back to IDRC, and it's a great honor to have him with us. He went afterward to the World Bank. He was also very important in the genesis of the environment program of the World Bank with David Hopper, that was then vice president of World Bank after his stay at IDRC. And his work that was early in his career at IDRC really helped out, as we have discussed, to promote this and to make it grow, scale up, as it's often used in our world, to a level and a scale that was not seen very frequently, or still not seen very frequently. So the topic is very accurate for today. It's about an innovation that has been developed, scaled, embedded in a social context, understood, and still today is in development. And I'm sure he will tell us more about this story. L'action et les orientations de recherche.
The research orientations and Mr. Hillel's work is altogether. He works on the rarity of water, either for a better irrigation of soils or to preserve resources, and more particularly a time where climate change is very present on the whole planet. So this work is more and more valid.
Converting 550 kilometers square of land from surface to drip irrigation that increase annual citrus yield by 55% while saving 3,000 cubic meter of water per hectare. These are accomplishments. There's a number of other projects that we had in Tunisia and the Caribbean that I could, get and drill in detail. I won't, because I want Mr. Hillel to tell us his story. It is a real privilege. In the last 48 hours, I had an opportunity to have a frequent interaction with Daniel and his wife. Welcome, Hassi, who is archaeologist at the Haifa University. And he's not only an excellent scientist. He is a man of a great sense of humor, and I mean it. We were at the reception Monday night, and he told a joke to Mr. Fantino, and Minister Fantino just burst in laugh. It was, and I burst in laugh also. He has a fine sense of humor, but also he's driven by, a very fulfilling spiritual life also that don't impair his scientific capacity, but goes hand in hand with it, and that was quite telling in numbers of time in our last 48 hours. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said the following last October when he received his prize in Des Moines, Iowa. His work will become even more important as we grapple with how to feed the world's growing population. The world will need to produce 60% more food, and the demand for water to grow that food will rise by almost 20%. But our supply of water is finite. So to strengthen food security, we have to get more out of each drop. I will turn the floor rapidly to Dr. Hillel for him to talk to you. Then Stephen Meggert, our Director of Agriculture and Environment, will have a brief conversation with Dr. Hillel, and we will turn, as we are doing normally in these conversations, to you for your question. We will ask you, as usual, to be brief, to identify yourself, and entertain a conversation with Dr. Hillel. And I take this opportunity also to welcome the people that are looking at us on the web and thank them for their question also that we will display on the monitor over here and that Stephen and Danielle will try to answer over the conversation. Danielle, I have a gift for you. When you came in 1972 and you left out with a fellowship, you knew that it was going to be helping you out. And you know that IDRC as an institution was looking forward to your report. You might not have realized that we kept the report because we have very good system over here. And it has been digitalized and takes to our library service and our communication services. I have the full copy of the report for you. Computer simulation of soil water dynamics, a compendium of recent work by Dr. Daniel Hillel. Daniel, pleasure to invite you at the podium.
Should I begin reading it?
Well, Daniel gave me a book on Monday night, and he says, you're going to have an exam at the end of the semester. And he says, like in the U.S. system, it's going to be true or false. I said, when is the end of the semester? He says, on Thursday. I said, oh, my God, how am I going to do it? He says, but there's a trick. The answer can only be true and true. So, I'll flip it to you. The test is tomorrow. Thank you. Welcome. And just before I move, there is interpretation service available in French and English. If you need a pair of headsets, they are available at the back. So thank you very much.
Jean, thank you so very much for this introduction. Would that I could live up to it. And now, I wish to speak to you briefly, don't worry, about science and the crisis of the environment. The history of humanity, so wrote the noted historian H.G. Wells, has always been a race between learning and disaster. The threat of disaster is always with us, only its form changes repeatedly like a many-headed dragon. Whenever one ugly head seems vanquished, another one rises. So the victory of humanity over disaster is never complete, and the final outcome remains in doubt. Once the major disaster was famine. As natural food resources were depleted, that disaster was apparently averted for a time by the advent of agriculture. But the resulting growth of villages and then towns set the stage for the new disaster of pestilence. And then, as medicine learned to control disasters one by one, it induced a further round of population growth, which in turn created a host of new and unforeseen threats. The danger of hunger has reared its ugly head again and is not yet completely alleviated by the further development of scientific agriculture and technology. Already, however, this development has been accompanied quite unexpectedly by new threats of environmental damage, destruction of natural vegetation, extinction of species, degradation of land and water resources, and finally, even a change of the global climate. From the ecological point of view, the history of civilization is the story of the adaptation or maladaptation of human societies to their environment. Starting early in their career as a species, human beings began to develop the means not merely to adjust to natural conditions, but also to modify those conditions to suit their own convenience. Using fire and a series of increasingly elaborate mechanical devices and domesticating plants and animals, humans changed the area of their abode by modifying plant communities and manipulating the soil and the water regime. As long as such activities were confined to small enclaves, the larger realm could remain in a more or less natural state. Over the course of time, however, human interference with natural processes has grown in extent and intensity until at last it has come to encompass the entire biosphere. Its ultimate consequences may be fateful to the continuance of life on Earth as we know it. The domain subject to human influence is now so large and complex as to be incomprehensible to most humans. So individuals and societies, driven by short-term aims, continue to assault the environment, oblivious to the mindless threat, the potential long-term effects. The danger is that our physical reach has greatly exceeded our ability to grasp the results of our own actions. The entire machinery of our society, in fact, is geared to the short term. We are a materialistic culture, directed toward immediate gratification of perceived needs and wants. Instant coffee, fast food, rapid reading, ready-made, over-the-counter, prepackaged remedies of all personal and social ills, elections every 2 or 4 years with choices obscured by 1-minute sound bites. There seems to be no mechanism in our governance for long-term concern. Not to say planning. No constraint to hasty action, no time for hesitation, no patience for reconsideration. We are like a drunken driver in the night, desperately trying to steer a vehicle traveling ever faster into an unknown trackless terrain full of lurking obstacles and hidden pitfalls shrouded in darkness. In this dizzying, headlong journey, it seems that the only mechanism we do have to guide us through the rough terra incognita is the practice of science. An objective, systematic, cooperative, and universal search for knowledge, understanding, predictability. Surely that is something we should be able to rely on. A beacon of light along our dangerous path. Alas, science itself is now in the throes of a quandary, uncertain of how to proceed. Because of the human mind's inherent limitations in comprehending too many phenomena, we tend to simplify the complexity of nature. We delude ourselves that variables can be separated, that events can be isolated from their contexts, that specific causes can result in specific effects without side effects. Science and scientists have long operated on the premise of ceteris paribus, which in Latin means all else being equal. When all other controllable variables are kept constant, then the change in one variable can produce a definable effect on another variable. So we build elaborate laboratories to eliminate complications and seemingly extraneous effects, to control temperature and humidity and pressure and mass and volume of components, the presence or absence of organisms, etc. Then we manipulate the variables one by one to observe the behavior of the system under controlled conditions. The trouble is that the results thus achieved pertain to an artificial microcosm of our own creation, not necessarily to the complex natural system that lies beyond our laboratories, beyond our control. For in the natural world, ceteris non paribus is the rule. All else is never equal. All phenomena affect one another. The whole, contrary to Euclid's dictum, is greater than the sum of its parts. It includes their numerous interactions, some of which may escape our immediate notice. So we face the necessity to devise a new approach to science. An inclusive, holistic, macroscopic approach to complement our long preoccupation with phenomena isolated from the larger context. This calls for the construction of more and more comprehensive models to incorporate the heretofore ignored complexities of the real world. But herein lies the dilemma. The more comprehensive our models, the harder they are to communicate and especially to test. So the temptation is to declare our models true without testing. But as we all know, untested models may be merely constructs of simplistic minds, divorced from the complications of reality. A wag once made the observation that the world of science is divided between specialists and generalists. Specialists try to learn more and more about less and less. Ultimately, they may know everything about practically nothing. Generalists are those who learn less and less about more and more until ultimately they might know nothing about everything. The only way out of this reductio ad absurdum is, of course, to make the effort to learn more and more about more and more. But then the task of research becomes harder and soon exceeds the ability of individuals to carry through. For most of us, the age of the Renaissance scholar is long past. Hardly any of us has enough time, strength, knowledge, equipment, and wherewithal to carry through alone. Ayn Rand's idea of the superior individualist endowed with autonomous wisdom, exemplified in her novel The Fountainhead, is a dangerous myth. Few problems encountered in the real world are in the exclusive province of any single discipline or scientist. The science of the environment now requires multidisciplinary teamwork, multidisciplinary, multinational, global, encompassing teamwork. Despite much lip service paid to such teamwork, our system still discourages it. Our institutions of education and research are so structured as to compartmentalize arbitrarily defined disciplines. Moreover, our system of funding research and promoting scientists still favors small-scale projects and individual achievements. Surely such individual performances are important and will continue to be. What we seek is not total abrupt shift from individual science to group science, but a better balance between the two. The human animal has always been driven by innate, contradictory, yet simultaneous tendencies toward individuation and socialization, competition and cooperation, separation and communalization. The constant contest between those opposing instincts is now too apparent in the national and international political arena. Unfortunately, they manifest themselves in the realm of science in an unbalanced way. Science fundamentally is a collective endeavor, a synthesis of the contributions of numerous individuals operating in concert. As environmental scientists, we are especially called upon to promote holistic approaches to the study of the biosphere, where physics, chemistry, biology, indeed all phenomena, are inextricably intertwined. Hence, we must actively work to pool our intellectual and physical resources in an effort to achieve a comprehensive understanding of what is inherently too complex and too urgent and too fateful to be entrusted to the exclusive judgment or discretion of individuals. The quest for such understanding will not always be orderly, harmonious processes leading automatically and rapidly toward consensus. Rather, it will often be disorderly and contentious, as was the ancient Greek agora, which served as a marketplace of ideas and goods. Here we come upon another dilemma. We are if we are not to set our individual aims alone, but try to coordinate our efforts in the context of larger projects, the question is, who will set the agenda? The most crucial decision in any research project is made at the very outset. What to research? That decision is particularly problematic because it must be made at the very outset without full knowledge of the system to be studied and of the findings that portend. It seems to me that the worst way is to allow funding agencies to dictate our priorities and topics from top down. If we submit ourselves passively to the judgment of bureaucrats as to what ought to be researched at any moment, we are in danger of abdicating our own prerogative and creativity in a kind of slavish effort to ingratiate ourselves with the powers that be. There is no reason to assume that the money, generally public money, at their disposal endows funding administrators, shielded as they may be by committees and anonymous reviewers, with some superior wisdom regarding scientific priorities. Another danger is to follow the fad of the year or the decade, to fall in line, to pursue the topics considered most fashionable or glamorous, and most likely to generate recognition. One possible way out of this quandary is to try to put our heads together, to ponder and debate what are the topics and the approaches that might really be worth researching. Not that these topics are ever knowable or definable precisely. After all, research is inherently a foray into the unknown. But the issue seems worthy of consideration. Instead of doing this, however, we seem to spend most of our time together, as at annual meetings of scientific societies, listening to what has been done in the recent past, and precious little time deliberating what ought to be done in the future, in the near future, and how we might team up to do it, and then convince the funding oligarchs to support the work we recommend on our own initiative. To help us in this crucial stage, we need some way to pre-search topics by postulating scenarios and examining them systematically using models. Some of us, however, have been playing this heady game in excess. Time was when our science suffered from a surfeit of disjointed empirical data lacking a coordinated theoretical framework. Now, we seem to suffer from the opposite syndrome, a profusion of theories and models quickly published, especially as our scientists are rewarded for rapid publication, without experimental validation. The ubiquitous availability of ever more powerful computers capable of grinding out calculations and solutions to sets of equations, once considered intractable, has brought about an explosion of theory-based publications. Not a few of these are totally unproven relevance to the natural system they purport to depict. The dilemma is that while the costs of computing have been falling, the costs of experimentation, especially that of field studies, involving equipment and labor and time, all these costs have been rising. Consequently, more of us, and hence more of our students, have tended to view the process of nature through the peculiarly idealized and neatly ordered perspective of the computer, thus turning our backs on the exasperatingly ill-behaved and messy real world. A major reason why field experiments in the environmental arena have become more difficult to run is the need to make them more comprehensive. To truly portray the workings of nature, experiments must include consideration of the multiple relevant factors to be continued long after, to observe their time-removed and space-removed effects on a larger scale. The task of comprehensive field experiments generally requires a great investment of time, effort, and patience, and then may yield only uncertain results. Nevertheless, it is an inescapable task, without which our models remain unproven and may even be misleading. When used by those unaware of their inherent limitations, models are capable of doing more harm than good. Not only do many of our models remain unvalidated, but also the parameters which are fed into them to characterize the system are often estimated by computational contrivance rather than by direct measurement on the appropriate scale in the real world. The problem of parameter determination is one too long evaded by those who are in too great a hurry to use models as working tools. Inferring parameters from empirical equations or lifting values out of what just happens to be available in the literature for seemingly analogous conditions are common stratagems to avoid making the actual measurement. The use of inverse models or methods or parameter estimation seems promising, but such methods are yet insufficiently developed and applied in our field. The problem of measurement scale is not merely technical, it is conceptual as well. Each branch of science is based on the implicit scale or domain of consideration. For example, classical soil physicists, and I'm one of them, typically dealt with the soil and its processes on the scale of centimeters, or at most a few meters, while hydrologists view phenomena on the scale of many kilometers. Reconciling such divergent points of view can be difficult because processes taking place in large-scale domains, such as the environmental continuum, often obscure micro-scale processes and therefore cannot be characterized merely by averaging the results of small samples, however numerous. So the scale of measurement, as well as the scale used in models, must be tailored to the characteristic scale of the processes being investigated. The time has come to balance the emphasis on developing ever more sophisticated models with a re-emphasis on the need for more comprehensive, cooperative experiments. Ask not the computer simulation alone, for it may portray a make-believe world. Ask nature itself, too, by means of a series of large-scale, well-designed, well-documented, cooperative experiments and observations, measurements. Theorists are like undiscovered playwrights, yearning for good performers to redeem their plots. Experimenters are like professional actors, always hoping for a good play in which to perform. It is only when, by good fortune, the twain meet and join forces that we can expect a really good show. I began this talk by referring to the history of civilization. So it is appropriate that I try to end it with an attempt to project into the future. It seems to me that the progress of civilization can be represented as a succession of expanding concentric spheres of inclusion. Primitive humans, aware of the dangers surrounding them, apparently classified living beings into two categories, us and them. Us and them. The former, the us category, good. The latter, dangerous, bad. Early in the career of our species, the us was a small nomadic band consisting of a single family or an extended family. Gradually, the us category expanded to include an enlarged clan, then a tribe, a village, a town, a nation, an international regional association, then further expansion. Now it seems, despite the appearance of retrogressive trends here and there, that civilization is moving toward the stage of global human inclusion, encompassing all the nations of the world in an amicable and mutually responsible association. Looking beyond that stage, we perceive the ultimate goal, a conscious, committed inclusion of the entire biosphere, with all its myriad living species, all engaged in an harmonious performance of life, like an enormous symphony orchestra, with humanity not an autocratic conductor, but one symbiotic player among many. This accords with a new perception of biological evolution, not primarily as a grim and grueling battleground for the survival of the fittest, but as a stage for the gradual coalescing of organisms into elaborate communities. According to this view, the growth of life is impelled more by the principle of symbiosis and cooperation than by separation and competition. As human beings and as scientists, we would do well to adopt the same principle as our common goal. I come to my conclusion, reminding ourselves that the Latin name for humans was derived from humus, the stuff of the soil, from which were also derived the words humble and humility, from humus, the soil, the earth. It seems ironic that we should have assigned to our species so arrogant a name as Homo sapiens sapiens, wise earthlings, as we ponder our past, our present, and the future of our relation to the earth. We might consider changing our collective name to the more modest Homo sapiens curans, with the adjective curans denoting caring or caretaking, as in the title curator. Of course, we must strive to deserve the new name, even as we have not always deserved the old one. The soil, biota, the ecology of the earth, all these have always nurtured us despite our abuse of it. It is high time for us, as Homo sapiens curans, to protect and nurture the biosphere, the entire ecosystem. In return, let us then dedicate our efforts to ensuring the sustainable coexistence of Adam and Adama, of humanity and the biosphere. Thank you.
Very nice. Very good. Well, thanks so much, Daniel, for clarion call for us to change the conversation on our stewardship of this earth. You've led an extraordinary life, and I thought we might open the conversation by talking a bit about some of the directions you've taken in your life, many of which will be relevant to a number of people here at IDRC, but beyond as well. You came back from the States after study to undertake a study, as I understand, of the soils of Israel. But then you chose to carry out an experiment in living in one of the most dangerous, inhospitable places in the entire state of Israel, and one might venture to say in one of the most dangerous, inhospitable places on the earth. You had other places you might have chose to actually carry out this experiment in living, this experiment in developing alternatives to, frankly, environmentally and economically disastrous irrigation models that had preceded some of your work. Why did you choose the Negev?
Well, I suppose I'm an adventurer by nature. And I returned from the United States to Israel in the year 1951, beginning of 1951, fresh with a master's degree, and at the age of 20, and deluding myself into thinking that I'm a complete scientist. And I was given the task of mapping the soils of the country for the first time. I was given a rickety old Second World War Jeep and a few instruments and a few assistants, and sent starting in the north, Galilee and the regions adjoining Lebanon and Syria, and working my way south. And then the Negev, 2/3 of the size of Israel, completely empty at the time. But there was evidence in the Negev desert of earlier civilizations that had adapted to the constraints and the opportunities posed by that region. And I was fascinated by that evidence and joined with a group of equally adventuresome young people. We were 12 at first, and we pitched our tent in a place,
a wadi somewhere, I'm sure.
Wadi of somewhere nearby, a plain overlooking the chasm, the great canyon in the midst of the Negev highlands. And I'm sad to say that within the first year, we lost 3 of our 12 members to marauders who didn't recognize Israel's intrusion into what was an open domain where tribes, nomadic tribes, roamed since time immemorial, or so it seemed. And then, about a year later, I hope you don't mind this unbelievable tale, we noticed a convoy heading south, passing along near our encampment, a convoy of military vehicles, and in the midst of the military vehicles was a black limousine. And abruptly the convoy stopped and turned to our encampment, and the doors of the limousine flung open, and out stepped an elderly gentleman with frizzy white hair. Seemed elderly to us at the time. he was 60s. Now he seems like a young man. Instantly we recognized that this was David Ben-Gurion, the founding father of Israel, the George Washington of Israel. And he was very curious. He wanted to know, what are you doing here in the middle of this desert? And we told him, well, we're...
Causing an international incident.
Yes, that's right. What are you doing with intruders here? And we said, well, we're trying to re-enliven the region, to husband the runoff waters from the streams and build terraces, hold the water, grow crops, and flocks of sheep and goats. Says, but who's helping you? Who sent you here? Has the government sent you? We said, no, the government's not sent us. We brought ourselves. He said, but what political party do you belong to? He said, he was very suspicious. He said, no, we don't belong to a political party. We absolutely are non-political. He said, but you need more help, don't you? He said, yes. You need more members? He said, yes. What are the qualifications for membership? He said, well, people who are willing to work hard and are congenial. He said, are there any age limits? Would you accept an elderly couple? We thought he was joking. And so we said, well, if they're willing to work. But then we looked at his wife, and she was ashen-faced. She looked at him with incredulity. The unbelievable happened, much to the sensation of Israel and the world. Ben-Gurion turned the convoy around, to the consternation of the army officers who wanted to show him their plans for the defense of the region, where they would place their tanks and fortifications and so on. Turned the convoy around, returned to Jerusalem, resigned from the government, and came to join our little village as a member. It was an international sensation. It's an incredible story. Now that I tell it to you, I don't believe it myself. And then something even stranger happened. The guys didn't know what to do with him, and they said, Danny, you take him. Put him to work. Do what you can with him. So I'm the only person alive who can say, quite honestly, I was Ben-Gurion's boss. So every evening I would go to his little hut, ostensibly to give him the assignment for the morrow.
Feed the goats.
To feed the goats and to make the meteorological measurements and others, and help in preparing the reseeding of pastures by, going through the packets of seeds. And
like any good Zionist.
Like any good Zionist, exactly. But really to engage him in conversation. And he was then in a contemplative mood, writing his memoirs, and was willing to discourse. And I had the temerity, in Hebrew that's called chutzpah, to challenge him sometimes on the issue of peace and making peace and reconciliation with the neighbors. And so we had some wonderful conversations, memorable conversations. And from time to time, a helicopter would appear and descend in our little encampment and bring visitors, important visitors, such as the Secretary General of the United Nations, or a visiting dignitary, a president. On one occasion, the helicopter descended and brought a gentleman from a faraway country called Burma in Southeast Asia. And the man's name was U Nu. And soon enough, U Nu asked Ben-Gurion to send
Minister of Burma.
The Prime Minister of Burma, the founding father of Burma, asked the founding father of Israel to send a delegation to Burma to help in developing the northern provinces of Burma, which are called the Shan states and the Kachin area, which were very sparsely populated in the the Burmese were very concerned that the Chinese might expand into their territory, and they wanted to try to develop that land. And soon enough, I found myself dispatched from the desert of the Middle East to the rainforests of the Far East, because UNU asked for expertise. Ben Gurion thought that I was an expert. So I had to learn, do experiments. I spent a couple of very interesting years in the humid tropics of Southeast Asia. And that began an international career for me. And I've been filling in the gaps between the desert and the jungle ever since. I've served in 30 or 40 different countries throughout Asia and Africa, South America, and so on. And in between, completed my doctorate and taught many courses, and the rest is history.
Well, let me probe a little bit on this. Clearly, post-war Israel was a developing country, and the Negev perhaps undevelopable country in some ways. And the Shan states of Burma, clearly a very, very different world. How did that influence the sorts of questions you decided to pursue in your subsequent career, working in many different countries, Jordan, Pakistan, and beyond, both for agencies like the IDRC, but also with David Hopper at the World Bank? In what ways do you feel that might have helped you choose certain kinds of questions to focus on?
Conditions are different in different sites, but the science is the same. Essentially, scientists are and ought to be, by right, by mission, internationalists, globalists. Everything is interactive. The principles are the same. Their manifestations are different in different locations. The combination of circumstances. But the principles of science are universal. There is no science for Southeast Asia different from science of Southwestern Asia or Siberia or Kamchatka or Tierra del Fuego, whatever it is. The science is the same. So scientists who dedicate themselves to understanding the environment, understanding the potential and the interaction of biota and human beings within the context of the environment are universalists. The real universalists in this world are scientists. And it's an obligation. It's not just a privilege, it's an obligation. And I have been preaching this to my fellow scientists ever since, sometimes unnecessarily, oftentimes unnecessarily, because they realize that. To pursue science is a mission, and it's a global mission.
Now, you've, among many, many accomplishments, helped, as Jean said earlier, to spread ideas of how continuous, low-volume water application to plants could well extend livelihoods in very effective ways for smallholders in frankly, extraordinarily difficult situations. You've done that in many, many different countries around the world, all with extraordinarily different contexts and settings. I wonder if you could say something about what characterizes
Yes.
A tipping point for adoption at scale of these kinds of new ideas.
I'm so glad that you asked this question, because this is the crux of what I really want to emphasize. irrigation began in the river valleys of the Middle East. The valley of the Tigris-Euphrates, farther east, the valley of the Indus River, and farther west, the valley of the Nile, and in between, the small valley of the Jordan River and the Orontes, Syria and Lebanon. And it was based on the periodic diversion of the rivers when in spate, generally in the wintertime or early spring, spreading the waters of the rivers over the land, soaking the land, saturating the soil to great depth, and then planting crops in the wake at the recession of the floods. And the plants were expected, the crops were expected to subsist on the water stored in the soil without replenishment. In modern times, when irrigation was practiced, and first began in the United States, modern irrigation was first practiced by the Mormon people who left the eastern United States and wandered through the arid lands and settled in a state they called Deseret, nowadays called Utah. They practiced irrigation in the same way, by diverting water from the river they had, which they called the Jordan.
Go figure.
They perceived themselves to be descendants of the ancient Israelites, reenacting their wanderings. And
every man has a dream.
Yes. And so, again, they practiced irrigation in the same way, by flooding the land. That mode of irrigation is self-destructive, ultimately. And it has caused the demise of great civilizations in the past. The civilization of southern Mesopotamia and the civilization of the Indus River Valley. And not quite but almost the civilization of Egypt. And the reason is that applying water in excess builds up a water table. Doing this year after year raises the water table until a point at which capillary rise brings up groundwater to the surface. Evaporation takes place, salts concentrate, and the soil becomes waterlogged and saline at the same time. So irrigation-based societies, by flooding the land, put themselves out of business eventually by degrading the soil, salinizing it, waterlogging it.
Over scores of years.
Over centuries. It's a slow process. It's invisible at first, but eventually it takes hold. And so parts of southern Mesopotamia, for example, are salt flats. But in these salt flats you see the mounds, the tells, the remnants of the ancient civilization, the cities.
So too in the Indus.
And in the Indus, yes. Harappa and Mohenjo-daro.
Mohenjo-daro, indeed.
So the new paradigm of irrigation, conceived, and very interestingly, by people who were not traditional irrigationists, not traditional farmers, newcomers to the art and the science and the practice of irrigation, the Israelis. How to change the paradigm of irrigation from excess water, flooding the land periodically, to continuously applying the water little by little, like spoon-feeding a baby. Imagine taking a baby, prying open the mouth, stuffing the baby with food, and then leaving the baby for a week or 2 weeks, and then prying the mouth once again, stuffing. That's the old paradigm of irrigation. The new paradigm of irrigation is slowly feeding the baby in response to need. And that's what drip, trickle irrigation consists of. It was not possible in the past to do this because water can only be conveyed through open channels and lots of loss by seepage, or concrete-lined channels which were very expensive, or metal pipes, which were also very expensive and water needed to be pressurized, and the metal pipes also tended to corrode and so on. But in the wake of the Second World War, in the 2 or 3 decades following the war, new materials came into being. The plastics industry, a byproduct of the petroleum industry, weathering-resistant plastics, which were low cost. And it became possible to convey into the field through narrow, cheap plastic tubes that could be perforated to convey the water little by little, drop by drop, like spoon-feeding a baby. When you plant a crop, the seeds germinate. It doesn't require much water, but it requires for the soil to be moist. And then, as the plant grows, extends a root system, develops a canopy, you need to apply more water, but judiciously, never to excess, just enough to maintain an optimal condition and leach out the excess salts, if such exist. Now, this realization came about in the late 1950s, 60s, through the 70s in Israel, significantly by people who were not traditional farmers, who were newcomers to the art and science of irrigation. And that is what made them able to innovate, to try new things. It seemed ridiculous at first, but it turned out to be the much more efficient way to apply water, and the crop per drop improved enormously.
And now there's a very vibrant international private sector driven industry around this irrigation. And as Jean mentioned in his remarks, there's a very large volume of horticulture and other forms of agriculture taken up.
Yes.
We ourselves and our sisters CETA across the river have been very engaged in support for a range of efforts to help spread the ideas and concerns about traditional ideas of irrigation and the damage they can bring, and alternatives and its spread. So, how is this? Why should we be so concerned about science? I mean, this seems like a big success story. That this seems like science has really played an effective role, building on hardship, innovating with new ideas, figuring out how to adapt those ideas to different contexts and settings, addressing major constraints and obstacles along the way. The public sector barely needs to be involved in this effort anymore. There's a very large private sector involved. Jane Technologies, one of the largest drip irrigation companies in the world, exports this technology all over the place commercially. How is that a failure in your view?
It's not a failure. It's not a failure of science. It's a progress of science, but change always meets resistance. There are vested interests and vested ways of doing things and vested patterns that are very difficult to change.
Indeed.
Let me give an example. Along the central to western regions of the United States, there's a large aquifer. An aquifer is a water-containing stratum, starting in northern Texas, the panhandle of Texas, and through Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska and South Dakota and North Dakota and into Canada. It's called the Ogallala Aquifer, known to many of you, I'm sure. When farmers first came there and began to practice irrigation in the 1930s, 40s, and so on and so forth, they began to deplete that aquifer because the replenishment rate of that aquifer is very low.
Yeah.
Much of the water,
water.
is fossil water. It's the result of earlier climatic periods when there's a lot of groundwater accumulated. There is replenishment, there is recharge, but it's slow. Extracting water in excess of the recharge rate depletes the aquifer and, of course, lowers the water table, so it makes the extraction of water more and more and more expensive. Now, private farmers next to each other compete. If I don't draw the water, you will draw the water from under me, because that water doesn't know boundaries, doesn't recognize surface boundaries.
Yeah.
And so, in effect, that farming region has been, to some degree, self-destructive. And the method of irrigation was the old method of irrigation, then applied by huge booms, the center pivot irrigation. When you fly over the West United States, you see these circular patterns of the water being drawn up and spread by moving booms, and sometimes to excess. So there's a lot of evaporation and some salinization as well. There's room for improvement, especially in places like, for example, California, the Imperial Valley and Central Valley in California, where water had been depleted and where salinization also has been taking place. So there are adaptations that are necessary in each case. It's not the same size fits all.
Yeah.
But the objective conditions, the soil conditions, the water, the sociological condition, the economy in each place differs. It needs to be adjusted. And so it is elsewhere, in India, in China, in Central Asian countries where I've worked, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan and so on. Uzbekistan is an interesting example. There, during the Soviet period, the commissars decreed that the waters of two streams, the Amu Darya and the CRDI, should be diverted for the production of wheat for the greater glory of the Soviet Union. And in the process, a beautiful lake, the Aral Sea, brimming with fresh water, fed by these two beautiful rivers, that deprived now of the rivers, the Aral Sea began to shrink and salinize, so that villages and towns with fishing boats are now stranded in the midst of what looks like a barren, salt-encrusted desert. And the lake has shrunk to about a quarter of its original size and only about a tenth of the original volume of water that it contained. So there's an example of degradation on a large regional scale affecting several nations. All that was not necessary. I helped, by the way, and I'm very proud of this, forgive me for being a little immodest, to introduce drip irrigation into Uzbekistan and to show that it's possible to grow crops more efficiently using less water. I have a little story to tell, if I may digress. On one of my trips not in Uzbekistan, but in a region of Pakistan, the west, the northwestern region of Pakistan. My first visit there, on behalf of the World Bank, I was traveling in a jeep and I saw a farmer flooding the land. And I stopped my driver and asked to engage the farmer. And the farmer said, I asked the farmer, do you think it's really necessary to throw all this water, pumping it up from a well, onto the land? And he said, yes, to grow big crops you need big water. And I asked, through my interpreter, if it might be possible to grow big crops by applying the water little by little, just little by little, one drop at a time. And the farmer thought that was just about the most ridiculous question he had ever heard. And he laughed because he had learned the way of irrigation, the way irrigation was practiced along the Indus River by flooding. Several years later, after helping to introduce drip irrigation into Baluchistan, I passed along the same road and saw the same farm. And the old farmer was now sitting at the shade of a tree drinking tea, while his son was tending to little tubes, dripping water along the plants, the apple trees that he was growing. And I came to greet the farmer, and he recognized me. He said, "By God,
you're the lunatic.
Science can really do everything." By Allah.
Well done, well done. I do want to open the floor in a minute for questions, but I'd be remiss if I didn't somewhat return to the subject of your talk with one final question. And that's really to ask you, where do you see the challenges in Middle Eastern agriculture with respect both to the devastation of the natural environment by us, that you spoke so eloquently about, but also the future challenges of an ever more active hydrological cycle in what is, frankly, a very water-scarce part of the world. And if I might, just given my personal self-interest, where would you see the real research challenges for us in addressing some of these larger problems that I know you've spent the last 2 decades primarily focused on?
Well, I think the research challenges are to define what are the optimal treatments or the optimal systems for each set of conditions. There is a tremendous variety, and in what is essentially a variegated region consisting of coastal plains and mountain ranges and slopes, some of them terraced, some of them steep and unterraced. Tremendous amount of erosion that had taken place in the past, and deposition of the erosional debris along streams, the accumulation of marshes that need to be drained. Then there's the rivers that have been diverted and are depleted. And so there's a range of conditions throughout the Middle East. The conditions are the same. The variation is there. So what has been done in Israel can be repeated if the nations of the region will stop engaging in strife and self-destructive, spiteful fighting and come together and cooperate, which is the vision of most of us, really, most of us, and on the other side as well. And I've worked in several neighboring countries. I've worked extensively in Egypt. Egypt has made peace with Israel, but Egypt is now in a tremendous quandary. One of the quandaries is the uncontrolled population growth. Very interesting. The case of Egypt is, in particular. We have the statistics on Egypt. Early in the 18th century, Napoleon invaded Egypt. And actually it was early in the 19th century. 1805. And he brought with him, his purpose was, of course, to disrupt the British Empire by cutting its link to the Suez Canal, to India, and also invaded Palestine, and very interesting episode in history. But he brought with him demographers and geographers who for the first time in modern age counted the population of Egypt, did a census, and also studied the antiquities of Egypt, and deciphered the ancient Egyptian writing, and began this archaeological study of Egypt. Champollion was the man who deciphered, the Frenchman who deciphered the Egyptian hieroglyphics and so on. But the demographers counted the population of Egypt. Would anybody here like to guess what was the population of Egypt 200 years ago?
4 million, 3 million?
Good. That's a good guess. What is the population of Egypt today? Say again. 7 million, did you say?
7 billion. I suspect that's probably a little bit off.
What did you say, 7 or 17? Or 70?
75 million.
75 million, close to 80 million now. Imagine a population of 3 million within 2 centuries becoming a population of 80 plus 85 million people on the same land and water base, which is why they built the Aswan High Dam in order to be able to irrigate not once a year, but perennially, to control the water and be able to irrigate twice, thrice a year, to grow crops continuously. But in the process, they induced salinization. By maintaining a high water table, they are now causing the salinization of the lands along the course of the Nile River, and especially in the delta region. And because the Mediterranean, the delta is now deprived of the silt, which is held back behind the Aswan High Dam, there is coastal erosion. So instead of extending into the Mediterranean, the delta is now receding. And you can see standing on the shore there near Rashid and Damia, the Rosetta and the Damietta outlets of the Nile, you can see stranded minarets in the sea where once there was a village. So there's the land has been receding by coastal erosion, and the land of Egypt is now subject to salinization. Early, the flushing back and forth of the Nile
that
annually
pulse of the Nile
naturally leached and drove out the excess salts. So because of this pulsation, Egypt seemed immune to that process of degradation or salinization that the soils of the Indus River Valley and of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys suffered from. Now Egypt too is subject to that degradation due to high water table conditions, high evaporation, accumulation of salts. And they now have to introduce artificial drainage of the saline soils, which is very expensive. So development that was not foreseen, a consequence that was not foreseen of a hasty development decreed by the then ruler of Egypt, Abdel Nasser, with the Soviet assistance, was insufficiently thought out, with insufficient precautions taken. And drainage is a very expensive operation. So it's a burden on the land of Egypt, and the population growth, of course, the uncontrolled population growth is itself a problem, imposing demands on a limited resource base. We have problems, which is why we have IDRC to help solve the problems.
I think with that, we'll ask you to ask your questions, not that we're immodest. There are microphones. Please I'll recognize speakers as they line up at the microphones. And please do give your name when you ask a question. I'll take the questions in sets of 3. So that way it'll be a little bit easier, Daniel, for you to pick the parts of questions you wish to respond to. Please keep your questions brief. We'll start over here with
easy.
With this, at the microphones, please.
Yes.
At the microphones, please.
Hi.
Please.
My name's Leon Surratt. I'm a retired English professor, so I have no expertise in these areas. A couple of questions. One, you have a namesake, Jacques Ellul, whose enthusiasm for science is not as great as yours, but that's just an aside. I have 2 questions. One is the drip irrigation seems a wonderful idea, but it requires a sequestration of water, and you said nothing about that. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. And the other question is really one off the wall, but you mentioned silt in the rivers, the mouths of rivers. Is it not possible to mine that silt and restore it back to useful?
Dredge it, warp it. Well, yeah. Fine, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll take one on this mic, and we'll go back this way, please.
But I won't remember the question.
Don't worry, I'll remember it for you. No worries.
Yeah, hi. My name is Sudhir Kodati, and I'm an independent researcher, and I was also involved in farming before I came to Canada. I was struck by the fact that you mentioned, you said the modern irrigation is first practiced by Mormons, and I don't know how long ago, but obviously it can be more than 300-400 years ago. But I come from a region of southern India in the state.
150, 160 years ago.
Yeah.
They began,
so
yes.
The place I come from, the Telangana region, or for that matter, in the southern India, we have tanks that used to take care of the irrigation needs, and these are at least 1,000, 1,500 years old.
Indeed.
And then tanks, the scale of the water captured could in my village, there are at least 3 or 4 tanks irrigating anywhere
Indeed.
from 100
could
to
you keep
500
your
villages,
comments to a question,
hectares.
please?
So this is very wide scale. Now, what I'm really surprised is when you mentioned about the salinity. Now, the Ashwan, or for that matter, in other places, this is a huge problem. Where that tanks were there, they irrigate, these areas have been irrigated for the last 1,000 years. We still don't have the water salinity problem. Right. Whereas water salinity problem is where there are high, the major irrigation dams.
Right.
So,
why not?
I don't know if you come across this instance and how the farmers used to manage the soil, how they nurture this. This is one thing I would want you to reflect upon.
Good. And last question for the first round. Over to you, sir.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Joachim Voss, ex-IDRC. If you're familiar with these instances, I'm curious what your advice would be to the Canadian federal government in its determination to close down the large-scale environmental experiments on Arctic and freshwater ecosystems.
The experimental lakes area of Canada. Good. So we've got a question around sequestration of water for drip irrigation. We've got a question around the mining of sediment at the mouth of rivers.
One by one.
One by one?
Repeat the first one, please.
So the question is, how does drip irrigation deal with the need to sequester water?
Drip irrigation depends on the availability of water. There's no getting around from it. But it demands less water than traditional irrigation methods. So, whether it's groundwater or water contained behind a dam or water in a freshwater lake or water directly from a stream, it needs a source of water. The advantage of drip irrigation is that it needs less water and that it's sustainable. That's, in essence, in a nutshell. The deserts don't always have a supply, but sometimes do, sometimes have a supply that could be brought in from the outside. For example, the Egyptians have tried to irrigate parts of the Sinai Desert by diverting what they called excess water from the Nile before it spills into the Mediterranean. So there's always an excess, they claim, and to some degree they're right, that could be used to irrigate land that was desert in the Sinai or in the Western Desert, in the area of Marsa Matruh and so on.
Dredging silt from the mouths of deltas.
Yes. I do want to add one more thing, one important thing, that with drip irrigation it is possible to bring into production soils that were not suitable for in any other kind of irrigation. Take sand dunes, for example. If you flood sand dunes, they'll quickly seep the water away and you lose it. But with drip irrigation, you can apply the water just so slowly that the sand is kept moist sufficiently to grow crops. So suddenly, land considered unsuitable for irrigation is now irrigable and productive. So there are many ancillary advantages that came into being in the course of time. Plus the injection into the water, which I mentioned before, of nutrients and of pesticides in order to maintain the very optimal conditions for the growth of crops.
And now ancillary hothouses, etc. That's huge.
That's right. In controlled environments, plastic-covered greenhouses or plastic tunnels, which are mini greenhouses, that make possible controlling the atmospheric environment within which the plant
which are now so ubiquitous in places like China.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Dredging silt from the mouth of rivers. Is it economic? Is it a useful way to go? Can we rely on that?
I have my doubts. It is an expensive operation. Better to control the migration of silt, the scouring of the land upstream. Mm-hmm. That's where we should concentrate our efforts, rather than allow the erosion and the sedimentation to be carried in, say, the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah. The Yellow River Delta.
The Yellow River Delta, that's right. The reason the Yellow River is a very interesting case. It's called yellow, of course, because it erodes that yellow silt called loess, L-O-E-S-S. And when it carries that silt into the sea, the entire sea is called the Yellow Sea.
You get the loess is moor.
You get. I've been resisting the temptation to punt.
I know you were.
And you've succumbed. Now you've given me license.
The question on village tank systems and why they don't lead to salinization.
Village tanks.
Yeah. So, the large catchment that feeds a seasonal reservoir just enough to irrigate a season of crops and then dries up.
What country are you referring to?
India.
In India.
Yeah.
Yes.
Southern India, but...
Yes. Well, the collection of water from intermittent seasonal streams into containers which they call tanks. That is reservoirs in my lingo.
Yeah.
That's a good thing. Now the question is, what do you do with that water? And whether it's used efficiently in irrigation or not. And now the question is also how to render the bottom of the reservoir relatively impervious, so you do not lose that water. And also the question of how to control evaporation. Otherwise, much of the water is lost by evaporation. There's a host of problems that need to be addressed specifically to the conditions and the requirements and the needs and the opportunities of each region. There's no one-size-fits-all. So there's plenty of work for scientists and researchers and for IDRC.
There we go. And your books are out there, a number of which I think speak to a whole series of questions around water and soil interactions.
Yes.
Joachim raised the question of the experimental lakes area and its closure by the federal government. I'm not sure if you know anything about this.
I would plead innocent in the interest of avoiding saying anything inappropriate or tell me.
I think we'll just go to the next question if you don't mind, Joachim. Please.
I do have a quick question, but first of all, thank you for such a brilliant speech.
Oh.
And I do hope you'll make it available on the web. I know I can certainly use it in my work, and I would be delighted to have access to it.
Might you tell us who you are?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Elizabeth McAllister, retiree from CETA and the World Bank, and I'm currently working as a consultant with FAO and the Global Environmental Facility. My question, Edward O. Wilson also said, as you have, that the pioneers of this century will be those who bring together the disciplines. As, for example, the neuropsychologists, the bioengineers. I've worked in a number of situations where I've been working with teams to try to bring together multidisciplinary approaches. And in fact, that's a major organizational change the FAO is going through now. There are all the obvious barriers to multidisciplinary teams in terms of structure and access to resources and recognition. But the one that I find most challenging is that in working with extremely smart people whose self-image is and self-knowledge, self-worth is based on being among the best in their field, it's very hard for them to cross into another science and to suddenly be alone without the knowledge and without understanding of the jargon. So if you had any advice on how to facilitate the conversations, to get teams working together across the disciplines at the very personal level so that you can find the professional satisfaction and not be threatened, I'd be very happy to hear from you.
I don't have a magic formula, but I am convinced, as you are, that it is necessary. And because it is necessary, we have to work on it. It is a task for us to reconcile what we've divided, to bring together, to recompose what we have decomposed, which is the human mind, by creating departments and separate institutions and disciplines and so-called disciplines and societies, separating into smaller and smaller factions until, we can finally know everything about nothing but feel that we are important within our own little comfortable domain. We have to reach out. We have to cooperate. The world is not decomposed unless we decompose it. So,
thanks.
I'll
take two more questions.
I do have to not forget. I must pay tribute, personal tribute, to David Hopper.
Indeed.
This is very, very important. I had a chance meeting with him. He visited Israel way back in the early 60s, I think. And I was asked by the director of the National Council for Research and Development to shepherd David Hopper, to bring him from place to place, show him the major research institutions in Israel. It was his first visit to Israel. And somehow we struck it. Friendships arise, and just as ours has. And in the case of David Hopper, it culminated that the 3 or 4 days that we spent together culminated in an invitation to come to Ottawa and be a guest of an institution you might have heard of, called IDR, can you remind me? C. And it was a smaller institution then, but full of promise, and full of vigor, and it's even fuller now. So that began a relationship between me and IDRC, and that relationship is extended. He then offered me something of a scholarship, and then when he shifted to the World Bank as vice president of the World Bank under McNamara, he set up an environment department and invited me to be a member of that environment department. And so my relationship with IDRC is long-standing, and I'm very grateful. And I laud your organization.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for inviting me again.
We're delighted, Daniel. Two last questions, please.
Good morning. I am Abdel Oliveros. I'm coming from Venezuela. I used to teach at the university and work as a consultant. Just a quick question. If you have got a good experience or example in South America.
An example of work in South America.
Yes, I've worked in South America, in several countries. I visited Venezuela, but I've also worked in Colombia in connection with their need for developing the outlet of their rivers, developing farms that would make use of rivers and irrigation. I've worked visited Uruguay, Chile, several other countries, and Ecuador. So, and I've also worked in Central America. So there's a host of problems there, and many possibilities, water resources along the Andes that are not sufficiently harnessed and utilized. Great potential for development, and very progressive governments in some of the countries. So I see great potential in South America.
Last question.
Thank you very much, Marie-Josée Mascotte, University of Ottawa. I'm in political studies, so not in the pure science, but I'd be really welcoming any feedback. I love your talk, thank you very much, but two questions very different. One is in terms of drip irrigation, is this applicable equally in large-scale agriculture versus small-scale, and how do you see the future in that respect? What's more important, or how is it received by different form of agriculture? Second question is about research, and I'd like to know, in your own experience, if social sciences has been included in teamwork that you're thinking of. Is this something you feel is important or not? Considering my own interest, I've been willing and hoping for collaborative work with pure science agronomist and all that, and this seems really, really difficult, and I want to know as well, what do you see as opportunity or closure of opportunity in terms of funding research, especially in this time of corporatization of university and research funding agency, I guess. Thanks.
I am myself an environmental and biology-oriented, agriculture-oriented scientist. I'm not a social scientist, but I recognize fully the importance of the social sciences and the need to integrate, to understand, to collaborate. We're not working in a vacuum. We're not working with plants and animals and water and soil and land alone. They're human beings, and they have structures of society, and sometimes these are rigid structures or flexible structures. Sometimes they are well fitted into the physical and biological environment. Sometimes they're ill fitted into them, and so there has to be an interaction. So it's teamwork that we need, social scientists along with an environmental scientist, physical scientists, hydrologists, and so on and so forth. Everything needs to be interlinked. We need to study more and more about more and more together. So not only interdisciplinary, but international cooperation is crucial. You had another question?
agriculture size when you're talking about drip irrigation?
Yes.
In terms of scale?
Yes. It is applicable on a large scale, but that goes without saying. What is important is that it's applicable on a small scale, because so much of farming in developing countries is done on a small scale by family farms. And they had no way of developing efficient irrigation because they didn't control the water, they didn't control the delivery of the water. Very often the delivery of water by decree was scheduled so that on the first Friday of every month a farmer would get a large volume of water for 3 hours. That was the paradigm in say, in Pakistan and other countries, Egypt as well. That is changed because now it is possible to convey small volumes of water through plastic tubes to be available continuously. So changing the paradigm, making it much more efficient, fitting the field to the bureaucrat sitting there and manipulating
the water gates.
The gates, exactly.
But is it related to the fact that
the gym gates
agriculture would take so much water and needs to change their own practice so that this can happen? It could happen separately.
Everything has to be integrated, all the way. And every part needs to fit in. No part can be missing, and the system work.
Please join me in thanking Daniel.